Russian President Vladimir Putin in Beijing for talks on trade and energy amid rising tensions that targeted after that war in Ukraine. The two leaders hailing unyielding ties after signing agreements on cooperation. Let's look at this visit with William Yang. He's senior analyst for Northeast Asia at the International Crisis Group. He joins us live from Taipei. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Yang. Now, alignment, both sides very keen to stress that alignment on strategy, alignment on thinking, alignment on positions, on regional and global issues, but not enough alignment on this Siberia pipeline too.
Right. I think you pointed out very importantly that for Russia and China, a lot of their core interests right now across the board really are quite aligned. But on this particular issue of the pipeline, we know that it has been a sticking point in the bilateral relationship. On the one hand, Russia really wants to be able to supply more oil and energy to China, but on the other hand, the Chinese government has been quite wary about becoming too dependent on one particular country as the source of its energy provider. I think this time the discussion is against the backdrop of the ongoing energy disruption caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I think from the joint statement that was released in the end by both leaders, it seemed like they are focusing and aligned on the general direction of deepening energy-related cooperations, including the Russian state nuclear energy company planning to also build more projects inside China. But I think ultimately, coming back to the pipeline itself, it's the flagship project. It certainly carries a lot more risks and also considerations that Beijing would have to take into account before it actually enters into this potentially multi-year project. So I think, based on the readout, we should be quite, optimistic that both countries are trying to work toward the direction of deepening energy cooperation. But I think China, at the end of the day, is really trying to look out for its own interest and making sure that its energy security policy remains focusing on diversification rather than switching from one provider, which is the Gulf countries, to another provider, which is Russia.
All right, we'll move on from this question in a moment, but just a follow-up. Chinese consideration, so any deal would involve some cost and some benefit for both sides. At this point, Russia would see the greatest benefit because it would give it markets which it has lost because of European objection to its war in Ukraine. But for China, as you've suggested, the concerns are too much dependence on any one country. But if it is in fact true that these two countries are fully aligned and ties are at never before seen levels, if China is going to be dependent on anyone, surely Russia would be the safest bet. So this suggests China still hedging its bets.
Right, exactly. Because, I think if anything, the Iran conflict has taught China a lesson that diversification should continue to be the guiding principle of its energy security thinking and policy. So despite the fact that there is, like you said, across-the-board sort of alignment on the policy and interests between Beijing and Moscow, on the other hand, I think Beijing does not want to put all its bet on something as important as energy in one basket. So if we remember, during the Trump-Xi summit and right after it, the American readout, in fact, suggested that I think it was the American side that offered that potentially China could also increase its energy purchase from the United States. So, but of course, in the Chinese readout, we didn't really see such wording being laid out. But I think at the same time, China would like to keep its options open and maintain more space for other alternative energy providers rather than completely investing all its resources into Russia, despite the fact that the risk of disruption across the border between Russia and China would indeed be much lower compared to the traditional maritime export from the Gulf region.
All right, Mr. Yang, I believe you have mentioned that Mr. Xi having the second summit from Mr. Putin just days after Mr. Trump left Beijing was his way of reminding Mr. Trump that Beijing has other solid and robust relationships. But even as Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin were meeting, the Chinese Commerce Ministry was announcing its continued commitment to its commitments to the U.S., including the buying of several hundred Boeing jets and commitment to cutting tariffs. So that's also China's way of reminding Russia that it has other options with the United States.
Right, exactly. I think for China, they do see now as being a rare moment where their global power and global standing is probably much higher and stronger than a few years back. And so it does see the fact that there are needs coming both from the US and Russia to solicit a stable and constructive relationship with Beijing. And it views itself as having more options than compared to these two great powers. So I think one aspect of the planning of these back-to-back summits is definitely sending signals to the other side. But I think what lies beyond the signaling is the importance for China to, in fact, on the one hand, managing the risk in the relationship with the United States to try to focus on stabilizing at least certain aspects of US-China relations. And on the other hand, to make sure that its relationship and partnership with Russia remains robust, because I think at the end of the day, Xi Jinping sees Putin as a partner and ally that is still more aligned with a common goal of pushing back against what they view as a long-standing US dominant global world order, whereas both leaders are aligned in trying to push forward and try to promote this alternative world order that is focusing on the emphasis of multipolarity.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us this evening, William. I'm looking back not just at Mr. Putin's summit, but at Mr. Trump's as well. William Yang, senior analyst for Northeast Asia at the International Crisis Group.